Hey, everybody. In the next two classes, there are a few key terms, key phrases, and key concepts that I want to make sure you have a good hold of to set the groundwork for the rest of the semester. So I highly recommend having a notebook handy, your laptop, your computer nearby so that you can take notes. Because research shows that when you take notes on what you're learning, you will retain that information and just ultimately you'll learn better. So that's my recommendation for everybody. I've created some visuals to help as well, and some charts that you can replicate in your notes. So these first few weeks of the semester are about setting you up to study diversity and difference for the rest of the year. So here's my agenda for our class today. We're going to look at citizenship, democracy, and community. I'm going to do a short exercise with you that you can replicate in your notes. I'm going to walk you through it. You can pause the video, spend a few minutes working on it, and then come back. I'm going to review some of these terms like domination and subordination, types of discrimination, and then we'll also talk about the podcast in just a moment from here. So key concepts for today's class include dominance, subordinates, temporary inequality, permanent inequality, individual discrimination, organizational discrimination, and structural discrimination. This is the individualized exercise for today. This is what I call defining the terms. What you'll see on the screen here is three different columns and different terms on the top of each column: citizenship, democracy, and community. Under each term, write down everything that comes to mind for you with that term. It could be a word, a phrase, a song, an image, a lyric, whatever it is. Just total brainstorm, brain dump onto your device or piece of paper. And then next, what I want you to do is after you've come up with your list, do you see patterns in the list? Do you see connections or disconnections? Do you have a positive, negative, or neutral reaction to these terms? What do these words mean to you personally, and how do you think they relate to the course? I always enjoy doing this kind of exercise with my online classes and my in-person classes, and the discussion that it generates is really fascinating for figuring out how these things sometimes are shared ideas amongst people, and sometimes they're quite different. So I recommend pausing the video right here so you can complete this exercise and then come back to it. I'm going to continue forward. I'm going to hope that you pause that video and that you are now returning for the rest of this class today. I assigned a podcast episode for you to listen to. This is a podcast show called Sunstorm with Alicia Garza and Aijen Poo. Now, Alicia Garza is probably most known for her work as one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, one of the Black women who started using that phrase and popularized it in the very beginning. And Ai-jen Poo is a community organizer, and a lot of the work that she does is in labor organizing. So they have multiple episodes. One I really liked, and that's the one that I assigned. It's episode 6. Now, I provided a link for you to listen to it. It's a great episode from start to finish, but I wanted to highlight this section that they have with this. They have an interview, and it is with Baratunde Thurston, who's talking about the concept of citizening. Now, he's talking about citizening as a verb. It is something that you do. It's not a noun, something that you are. Citizen is not a language that, in his conception, it's not a government phrase to define belonging based on paperwork and documentation, but rather it's about being a citizen of the world, a citizen of your community. It's about civic engagement. He has excellent examples of what citizening looks like in his own life. And I would ask you to do a little quick free writing exercise, maybe just taking up to 3 minutes again to pause the video, write down some notes on your own, and then come back for the rest of it. So, with that definition in mind, what acts of citizenship have you participated in? Or what acts of citizening, if you will, have you participated in? Now, he talks about becoming deeply interested in the police budget in his city where he lives in Los Angeles. What kinds of things are you curious about in your town, in your city? So you're thinking about these two things. What kinds of acts of citizening have you participated in? And what kinds of things are you curious about in your town or city? Go ahead and pause this video, write down some notes, and then come back when you're done. I'm going to move forward, hoping that you took the opportunity to reflect on some of these questions. This is from Thurston's website, and he has his own podcast called How to Citizen that I highly recommend. He talks about citizening or citizenship, again, not as a government document or government defined status, but rather it's about participating in your local community. It's showing up for each other and publicly participating. That goes beyond the idea of voting as your only form of citizenship or participation. It means investing in relationships, deepening relationships with ourselves, deepening our relationships with our community, our planet, our experience, trying to understand how we're all deeply interconnected. To citizen is to understand power, to start to hone in on what this term means and how it shows up, to start to learn from others who talk about this. Think about the various ways that it can be used for collective benefit rather than individual benefit. And finally, to citizen is to value the collective, to work towards outcomes that benefit many and not just the few. This is a term to citizen or citizening that we will be using for the rest of the semester and especially highlighting in your community engaged learning project around voter education. Okay, let's dive into the other readings. Jean Baker Miller has this chapter in your textbook called Domination and Subordination. And in this, she develops a few frameworks, a couple I want to highlight: temporary inequality and permanent inequality. Temporary inequality, she says, is usually something on the interpersonal level. It involves two people where one person has more power than another, but this is a temporary situation that is going to change. An example is a parent and a child. So in a parent-child relationship, you have two people where the parent has more power. It's an unequal relationship because the parent always has to make the decisions for what is in the best interest of that child. Now, in her conception, that is going to change. The child's going to grow up and become an adult, and then you have more of an equal footing between the two. I want to trouble that a little bit. And I think you can probably already think of examples of moments where there isn't quite the equality between a parent and a child. Maybe it's a situation where a child as a younger person has to take care of their parent. They're what we call a parentified child. There may be situations when a the adult continues into their elder years and has needs, and that child has to take care of them. So the relationship almost flips. And then you also have examples, just sort of like loving examples of where that parent is never going to see that child as anything other than their baby. So those are examples that I think complicate her idea of it being temporary a little bit, but I get where she's coming from. Permanent inequality is connected more to systems and structures. It is something that feels like it's unchanging. We can often get really dismayed by the state of the world and feel like it's always been like this and it's never going to change. Of course, we can talk more about how these inequalities that have come up do have a history, and do have a context around why they came up. But her point is that these feel more like they're permanent, like it's not going to change. That inequality will always be there, and it's always connected to systems and structures rather than two people kind of interacting in an interrelational way. So I think it is beneficial to create this chart in your notes. She has two columns, the dominants and the subordinates. So I put them into columns. I would make my notes look a little bit like this. And then I would recommend that you write down or translate as many things that she talks about around dominance and subordinates. Write down all the characteristics of dominance, write down all the characteristics of subordinates, just so you have it in your notes. For example, she says dominants set up society in their own image, and they make the rules that subordinates often have to follow. I would put that in the dominant column. Subordinates, on the other hand, are often fighting for their lives out there. They're fighting for basic needs and basic survival. they have to live often by the rules of the dominance. They have to live in a way that pleases the dominance. Otherwise, they are subject to um, many things. The worst things would be harassment and violence. So those are the kinds of things pick out of her reading and put into your own notes so that you have them and you retain those concepts a little bit better. The other thing I assigned today was a piece by the US Commission on Civil Rights, The Problem Discrimination. And I like the language that this commission has used to describe what discrimination is. They talk about it on the individual level, the organizational level, and the structural level. I would remake this in my notes in a way that looks kind of like this, again, using those columns. Now, individual, just to recap, individual is when you have conscious or unconscious bias that is emanating from one person. So conscious, they know they're biased, or unconscious, they don't realize they're being biased. And it's an individual, one person. I also labeled this as temporary inequality in trying to get those readings to talk to one another, because a person could become conscious and they could make efforts to change their bias. So there's a kind of hopefulness around that there. Organizational discrimination is often about rules, laws, and policies, as well as practices that appear to be neutral. They appear to be race, class, sexuality, etc., blind. So they appear to be neutral. This, to me, seems like the hardest one to put your finger on and the hardest one to kind of point out when it's happening. So this is both temporary and permanent at the same time. You could argue that it's either or both. It could be temporary, rules can change, policies, laws, all of it could change, right? The people involved could say, let's get rid of this. But it feels permanent, and sometimes it just feels like it's unchanging because it becomes so cemented or so solidified. If we think about the law, we know how hard it is to change laws and how difficult it is when it feels like they're entrenched, but it is changeable. And then structural is when you have discrimination that compounds onto one another and it reinforces one another. I think of it as a snowball that's going downhill and it's picking up additional snow and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger as it goes downhill. This is where you have the fact that sexism doesn't exist without racism supporting it. It doesn't exist without classism. It doesn't exist without heterosexism or homophobia. They all reinforce one another and kind of like work hand in hand to strengthen one another. Feels like permanent inequality, right? Structures are very, very hard to change. And it feels like these things have always been like this. They're always going to be like this. But I come into this with hope, right? I feel like, yes, we can continue to work towards changing and dismantling this kind of system that feeds on discrimination. So if I'm to carry one of these, give you one example that follows through each of these categories, I'm going to give you the example of a woman who is Muslim and wears a hijab, faces individual discrimination. No doubt, right? Biases, prejudice on the behalf of other people when they look at her. Organizational, here's an example. Let's say there's a job or an employment-based situation where the job has created this rule that says that all of the employees must follow this rule. You cannot have any visible form of your religious practice on your body while you are at work. Okay, this seems like it applies to everybody, right? It's a rule, it's a law, it's a policy. They've said it applies to all of their employees. Well, if you're Christian and you wear a necklace that has a crucifix or a cross, you can tuck that in under a shirt and you can hide that. And it's not visible. You're still complying with the policy. But if you're a Muslim woman and you wear a hijab as your expression of religious practice, you can't hide that. That is a part of how you present yourself to the world visibly. And so in this situation, we have something that appears to apply to everybody, but when it's put into practice, it really discriminates against certain forms of religious practice or certain forms of religious attire and not others. And then in this situation, we might talk about structural inequality, structural discrimination, which is Islamophobia becomes so kind of like baked into the way that laws, policies, society works. It is reinforced by racism. It is reinforced by sexism. The next week, you'll read something that talks about the gendered nature of Islamophobia, and it's a discrimination that kind of builds on and gets bigger and bigger and bigger the more get glommed onto it. Your voice thread for this week is going to be to come up with one example that demonstrates each form of discrimination. In the way that I just gave you that example of the woman who wears a hijab as her expression of her Muslim faith. You're going to come up with that one example. What does it look like on the individual face of things, the organizational, and the structural face of things? You're going to share that with your peers and your colleagues in VoiceThread, and then you'll be able to comment on each other's examples in the discussion that follows. So that's kind of that gives you the overview of what we're looking at today. We've got these various kinds of ways of thinking about inequality. We've got various kinds of way of looking at discrimination. We have this idea of citizening, of how you show up in the world and how you can kind of do little acts that make your community better. These are all the concepts connected to power, discrimination, inequality, oppression. They're not only terms that we're going to use the beginning of the semester, but we're going to use this language through the rest of the semester. It will show up again in your big project as well. As we look towards that signature assignment and the voter education project, it helps to think about acts of citizening. How do we show up for our community? How do we care for one another? And how do we demonstrate these acts of democracy in such small ways? This language is extremely helpful for understanding the histories of voter suppression, why people have very little faith in our democratic systems today, and why we continue to see this divisiveness in our political systems. I'm going to leave it here for now because I've given you quite a bit to think about with power, discrimination, inequality, oppression, and citizening. Take care, everyone. Bye for now.